Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel and welcome back for chapter 1 of Lord of the Flies. Here we go. Chapter 1, The Sound of the Shell. The boy with fair hair lowered himself down the last few feet of rock and began to pick his way towards the lagoon. Though he had taken off his school sweater and trailed it now from one hand, his grey shirt stuck to him, and his hair was plastered to his forehead. All around him, the long scar smashed into the jungle was a bath of heat. He was clambering heavily among the creepers and broken trunks when a bird, a vision of red and yellow, flashed upwards with a witch-like cry, and this cry was echoed by another. "Hi!" it said. "Wait a minute!" The undergrowth at the side of the scar was shaken, and a multitude of raindrops fell pattering. "Wait a minute!" the voice said. "I got caught up." The fair boy stopped and jerked his stockings with an automatic gesture that made the jungle seem for a moment like the home counties. The voice spoke again. "I can hardly move with all these creeper things." The owner of the voice came backing out of the undergrowth so that twigs scratched on a greasy windbreaker. The naked crooks on his knees were plump, caught, and scratched by thorns. He bent down, removed the thorns carefully, and turned around. He was shorter than the fair boy and very fat. He came forward, searching at a safe lodgment for his feet, and then looked up to fix spectacles. "Where's the man with the megaphone?" The fair boy shook his head. "This is an island. At least I think it's an island. That's a reef out on the sea. Perhaps there aren't any grown-ups anywhere." The fat boy looked startled. "There was that pilot, but he wasn't in the passenger tube. He was up in the cabin in front." The fair boy was peering at the reef through screwed up eyes. "All of them other kids," the fat boy went on. "Some of them must have got out. They must have, mustn't they?" The fair boy began to pick his way as casually as possible towards the water. He tried to be offhand and not too obviously uninterested, but the fat boy hurried after him. "Aren't there any grown-ups at all?" "I don't think so." The fair boy said this solemnly, but then the light of the realized ambition overcame him. In the middle of the scar, he stood on his head and grinned at the reversed fat boy. "No grown-ups," the fat boy thought for a moment. "That pilot." The fair boy allowed his feet to come down and sat on the steamy earth. "He must have flown off after he dropped us. He couldn't land here, not in a plane with wheels. We was attacked. I'll be back all right." The fat boy shook his head. "When we was coming down, I looked through one of them windows. I saw the other part of the plane. There were flames coming out of it." He looked up and down the scar. "Is this what the tube done?" The fair boy reached out and touched the jagged end of the trunk. For a moment he looked interested. "What happened to it?" he asked. "Where has he got to now?" "The storm dragged it out to sea. It wasn't half dangerous with all of them tree trunks falling. There must have been some kids still in it." He hesitated for a moment, then spoke again. "What's your name?" "Ralph." The fat boy waited to be asked his name in turn, but this proffer of acquaintances was not made. The fair boy called Ralph, smiled vaguely, stood up, and began to make his way once more towards the lagoon. The fat boy hung steadily at his shoulder. "I expect there's a lot more of us scattered about. You haven't seen any others, have you?" Ralph shook his head and increased his speed. Then he tripped over a branch and came down with a crash. The fat boy stood by him, breathing hard. "My auntie told me not to run," he explained, "on account of my asthma." Asmar? That's right. You can't catch my breath. I was the only boy in our school that had asthma, said the fat boy with a touch of pride. And I've been wearing specs since I was 3. He took off his glass and held them out to Ralph, blinking and smiling, and then started to wipe them again, his grubby windbreaker. An expression of pain and inward concentration altered the pale contours of his face. He smeared the sweat from his cheeks and quickly adjusted the spectacle on his nose. Them fruit, he glanced around the scar. Them fruit, he said, I expect. He put on his glasses, waded away from Ralph, and crouched down among the tangled foliage. I'll be out again in just a minute. Ralph disentangled himself cautiously and stole away through the branches. In a few seconds, the fat boy's grunts were behind him. He was hurrying towards the screen that still lay between him and the lagoon. He climbed over a broken trunk and was out the jungle. The shore was fledged with palm trees. These stood or leaned or reclined against the light, and their green feathers were 100 feet up in the air. The ground beneath them was a bank covered with coarse grass, torn everywhere by the upheavals of fallen trees, scattered with decaying coconuts and palm samples. Behind this was the darkness of the forest proper and the open space of the scar. Ralph stood, one hand against the great trunk, and screwed up his eyes against the shimmering water. Out there, perhaps a mile away, the white surf flanked on a coral reef, and beyond that the open sea was dark blue. Within the irregular arc of the coral, the lagoon was still as a mountain lake, blue of all shades and shadows, shadowy green and purple. The beach between the palm terrace and the water was a thin bow stave, endless apparently, for to Ralph's left the perspectives of palms and beach and water drew to a point at infinity, and always almost invincible was the heat. He jumped down from the terrace. The sand was thick over his black shoes and the heat hit him. He became conscious of the weight of his clothes, kicked his shoes off fiercely, and ripped off each stocking with each elastic garter in a single movement. Then he leaped back on the terrace, pulled off his shirt, and stood there among the skull-like coconuts, with green shadows from the palms and the forest sliding over his skin. He undid the snake clasp of his belt, lunged over his shorts and pants, and stood there naked, looking at the dazzling beach and the water. He was old enough, 12 years and a few months, to have lost the prominent tummy of childhood, and yet not old enough for indulgence to have made him awkward. You could see now that he might make a boxer as far as weight and heaviness of shoulders went, but there was a mildness about his mouth and eyes that proclaimed no evil. He patted the palm trunk softly, and, forced at last to believe in the reality of the island, laughed delightedly again and stood on his head. He turned neatly on to his feet, jumped down to the beach, knelt and wept a double armful of sand into a pile against his chest. Then he sat back and looked at the water with bright, exciting eyes. Ralph, the fat boy, lowered himself at the terrace and sat down carefully, using the edge as a seat. I'm sorry, I've been such a time. Them fruits. He wiped his glasses and adjusted them on his bottom nose. The frame had made a deep pink V on the bridge. He looked critically at Ralph's golden body and then down at his own clothes. He laid a hand on the end of the zipper that extended down his chest. My auntie. Then he opened the zipper with decision and pulled the whole white breaker over his head. There. Ralph looked at him sidelong and said nothing. I expect we'll want to know all their names, said the fat boy, and make a list. We ought to have a meeting. Ralph did not take the hint, so the fat boy was forced to continue. I don't care what they call me, he said confidentially. So long as they don't call me what they used to call me at school. Ralph was faintly interested. What was that? The fat boy glanced over his shoulder, then leaned towards Ralph. He whispered, They used to call me Piggy. Ralph shrieked with laughter. He jumped up. Piggy? Piggy? Ralph, please. Piggy clapped his hands in apprehension. I said I didn't want Piggy. Piggy. Ralph danced out into the hot air on the beach and then returned the fighter plane, with wings swept back and machine gun Piggy. Meow! He dived in the sand at Piggy's feet and lay there laughing. Piggy! Piggy grinned reluctantly, pleased despite himself at even this much recognition. As long as you don't tell the others, Ralph giggled into the sand. The expression of pain and concentration returned to Piggy's face. Half a sec. He hastened back into the forest. Ralph stood up and trotted along to the right. Here the beach was interrupted abruptly by the square motif of the landscape, a great platform of pink granite, trussed up incomprehensibly throughout forest and terrace and sand and lagoon to make a raised jetty 4 feet high. The top of this was covered with thin layer of soil and coarse grass, and shaded with young palm trees. There was not enough soil for them to grow to any height, and when they reached perhaps 20 feet, they fell and dried, forming a crisscross pattern of trunks, very convenient to sit on. The palms that still stood made a green roof, covered on the underside with a quivering tangle of reflections from the lagoon. Ralph hauled himself on to this platform, noted the coolness and shade, shut one eye, and decided that the shadow on his body was really green. He picked his way to the seaward edge of the platform and stood looking down into the river. It was clear to the bottom and bright to the inflorescence of tropical weed and coral. The school of tiny glittering fish flicked hither and thither. Ralph spoke to himself, sounded the bass strings of delight. Wheels! Beyond the platform there was more enhancement, some act of God, a typhoon perhaps, or the storm that has accompanied his own arrival. Has banked sand inside the lagoon, so that there was a long, deep pool in the beach with a high ledge of pink granite at the further end. Ralph had been deceived before now by the suspicious appearance of death in a beach pool, and he approached this one preparing to be disappointed, but the island ran true form. The incredible pool, which clearly was only invaded by the sea at high tide, was so deep at one end as to be dark green. Ralph inspected the whole 30 yards carefully and then plunged in. The water was warmer than his blood, and he might have been swimming in a huge bath. And Piggy appeared again, sat on the rocky ledge, and watched Ralph's green, white body enviously. You can't half swim. Piggy! Piggy took off his shoes and socks, ranged them carefully on the ledge, and tested the water with one toe.